Somewhere in Istanbul, right now, there's a wall with laundry hanging on it. Cars drive through the gaps. Kids kick football against the stones. Weeds grow out of the top of it, and fig trees push their roots through the cracks that nobody is in a hurry to fix. It looks like every other ruin in every other old city. Something to walk past on the way to somewhere better. But the real answer is far stranger. Because that wall is the reason there was a Europe for you to be taught about. Last time you saw the death that wasn't. A teenage emperor, sent home with a pension, a crown packed into a crate and shipped east. A year in your textbook that ended nothing at all. But now comes the one that did. You think 1,000 years is a long time to spend dying. That is the story you were handed. An empire past its best, sliding gently downhill for 10 centuries, propped up on an old glory until somebody finally pushed it over. You are wrong. That empire was not decaying, it was working, and the proof is standing in Istanbul right now with somebody's shirts drying on it. Look at what those stones actually were. They went up in the early 400s under an emperor named Theodosius II. And they were not one wall. They were a system. A moat, then a lower outer wall, then a killing ground, then an inner wall 5 meters thick and 12 meters high, studded by 96 towers. To reach the city, an army had to break through all of it in order while being shot at from above the entire time. In 447, an earthquake tore huge sections of it down. 57 towers collapsed, and Attila the Hun was marching toward the city. Constantinople rebuilt the whole thing in about 2 months. Not with an army, with its sports fans. The rival factions from the chariot races, the blues and the greens, who normally spent their time riding against each other, put down their grudges and rebuilt the greatest fortification on earth before the Huns arrived. Attila took one look and went somewhere else. That is not an empire in decline. That is an empire that fixed a wall faster than a hostile army could walk. And it kept happening. In the 600s, Arab armies swept out the south and took Egypt, Syria, North Africa, everything. They reached the walls in 674 and camped there for 4 years. They came back in 717 with a fleet and an army and settled in to starve the city out. Both times they lost, and part of the reason is a weapon that sounds invented. Around the year 670, an engineer named Kallinikos arrived in Constantinople with a recipe. What it produced came out of bronze siphons mounted on the prows of ships, and it burned on the surface of the water. It stuck to hulls, it stuck to men. And water made it worse. Arab fleets watched the sea itself catch fire and could do nothing about it. They called it Greek fire. The formula was one of the most closely guarded state secrets in history, known to a handful of families, never written down in full. It worked so well that it died with them. We still do not know exactly what it was. So sit with what those 2 sieges mean. If that city falls in 717, there would be no walls between the Caliphate and Europe that at a time was a scatter of small and poor illiterate kingdoms. Everything you were taught to call the Middle Ages happened in a shelter of a wall that Western Europe never once thanked, never once defended, and eventually stopped calling Roman altogether. They held the door, and nobody in the room ever turned around. Which brings you to a question that actually matters. If those walls were that good, and that empire was that competent, what finally killed it? Here's the twist. It was not the armies that spent 1,000 years failing to get in. It was Christians. It was friends. In 1202, an army left Western Europe to retake Jerusalem. The Fourth Crusade. It was badly planned and worse funded, and it had promised Venice an enormous sum for ships it could not pay for. So the Venetians, led by a doge named Enrico Dandolo, who was somewhere around 90 years old and completely blind, offered a deal. work off the debt, do us a few favors in the way. The historian Jonathan Phillips has traced how that debt walked an entire crusade sideways. One reasonable decision at the time, until in April 1204 a Christian army stormed the largest Christian city on earth. The walls that had stopped everyone finally failed, from the water side, against the one enemy nobody had built them for. What followed was 3 days of methodical destruction, not a battle. An inventory, bronze statues that had stood for 1,000 years were melted into coins, libraries burned, tombs of emperors were pried open for jewelry. The 4 bronze horses that stand over the entrance to St. Mark's in Venice today were levered off the racetrack in Constantinople that week and shipped home as furniture. Stephen Runciman spent his life studying this empire, and his verdict of the Fourth Crusade was that history had never seen a greater crime against civilization. Not one of the worst, but the worst. The empire never recovered. A Roman successor state took the city back in 1261, but what came back was not what had left. Broke, hollow, rattling around inside a capital built for 500,000 people who were no longer there. Travelers described whole districts inside the walls that had gone back to being farmland, grain growing between the houses, an empire reduced to a city, and a city reduced to a village wearing a city's clothes. For 2 more centuries it hung on anyway, still crowning emperors, still calling itself Roman, still holding that wall. And then in 1453, a 21-year-old sultan named Mehmed II arrived with something the stones had never met. Not more men, but better physics. Here's the detail that should stop you cold. The cannon that killed the Roman Empire was offered to the Roman Empire first. Its designer was a Hungarian engineer named Orban. He came to Constantinople, to the Emperor Constantine XI, and offered to build him the largest gun in the world. The empire wanted it desperately. The empire could not pay him. So Orban walked out, went to Mehmed and asked whether his gun could bring down the walls of Constantinople. Mehmed paid him whatever he asked. What Orban built was over 8 meters long and fired stone balls weighing more than half a ton. It needed 60 oxen to drag it into position and 200 men to steady it. It could only fire a handful of times a day, and the barrel eventually cracked itself apart from its own violence. It did not need to last. Those walls had been designed in a world before gunpowder, and no amount of thickness answers to a stone ball traveling faster than sound. The siege lasted 7 weeks. Roughly 7,000 defenders on a wall built for far more, against an army perhaps 10 times the size. Mehmed dragged 70 ships over land and greased timbers to get around the chain across the harbor. Orban's gun kept firing. The defenders kept filling the holes at night with rubble and barrels and earth, and every morning it started again. On the 29th of May 1453, a Tuesday, the walls broke. Constantine XI had one decision left. He could run. Ships were leaving. Instead, the historian Roger Crowley describes him doing the only thing that would make him impossible to find. He stripped off the purple, the cloak, the insignia, everything that marked him as an emperor, so that nobody could parade his body afterward. And then he walked into the breach as an ordinary soldier. He was never identified among the dead. That is where the line ends. Augustus to Constantine XI, 1480 years of the Roman emperors, unbroken, closing in a doorway with a man who had taken his own crown off. And then Mehmed rode into the city and did something that tells you exactly what he thought he had conquered. He took a new title, Kaiser Iram, Caesar of Rome. Read that again. The man who destroyed the Roman Empire understood better than the Western Europe ever did what the Roman Empire was. His enemies knew. His heirs knew. Only the people writing her textbooks decided it had been something else with a different name. in a different chapter. But the empire had one last thing to give away, and it gave it to the very people who would forget it. And it did not wait until the end to start giving it. This is the part people get wrong. The scholars did not flee the canon. They had been leaving for 50 years before Orban ever cast it, because they could see what was coming long before it arrived. In 1397, a teacher named Manuel Chrysolorus walked into Florence and began teaching Greek to Italians who had forgotten how to read it. In 1439, a delegation came west for a church council in that same city and brought Plato into a room full of men who knew him only as a rumor. Every year, the empire shrank. A few more scholars went west with their manuscripts under their arms. Aristotle, Homer, mathematics, medicine, astronomy. Texts the West had lost centuries earlier, or had never held at all. By 1453, that quiet reign had been running for 2 generations. The fall did not start it. The fall just opened it all the way. Europe called what grew out of the Renaissance the rebirth of the classical world. Rebirth is a generous word. Judith Herron has spent a career mapping how much of what Europe believes it recovered had never actually been lost. It had been sitting in libraries in Constantinople the entire time, copied and recopied by hand, guarded for 1,000 years by people the West had already stopped calling Roman. It did not come back to life. It was carried west, one satchel at a time, by men walking away from a country that was being erased behind them. So think about what this actually means for you. Not about Rome, about how you know anything at all. The Roman Empire did not lose because it was weak. It outlasted every enemy it ever had, held a continent's door shut for 1,000 years, and only broke when the people it was protecting stabbed it in the back and then built it for the knife. It lost the war for the past. It lost to a filing cabinet. And it lost so completely that you can stand in front of its walls today and see nothing but old stones with laundry on them. Anthony Caldelis has argued that we should simply stop using the name we were given and call those people what they called themselves, Romans, not because it is a nice gesture, because it is true. And because 1,000 years of people do not get erased by a librarian in 1557 unless everybody agrees to let it happen. Go and look at that wall again, the one with the laundry and the football and the fig trees pushing around the cracks. It still looks like a ruin. It still looks like the end of something that failed. But you now know the truth. Those stones held for 1,000 years. They only fell once, and it took the largest gun ever built to do it. And behind them, a man took off his crown so that he could die as nobody at all. That is not the wreckage of an empire that faded away. That is the last thing after the longest fight in human history. Rome did not die in a classroom in 476. Rome died on a Tuesday in 1453, defending a city nobody ever taught you to look for. And it's still there, still standing, still holding. You just have to know what you're looking at.